you guys so much for being here. So it is really I'm just thrilled and pleased tonight to introduce Kia Jarmon. I knew Kia, look, back when Kia was a Girl Scout, I knew Kia. And she was just as dynamic then as she is today. Kia is the agency director for a boutique communications and community engagement firm called MEPR. She is also the co leader of the Black Philanthropy Initiative here in Nashville. And she is a collective impact consultant with the Center for Nonprofit Management. But we are particularly honored because she sits on our board. So we're really excited to have Kia as a board member. And without further ado, Kia.
Thank you so much, Valerie. We have known each other for a very long time, and I see some familiar faces in the boxes. So I'm always glad to be among good company. I didn't put together a visual presentation because I think in the spirit of it being a conversation in 45 minutes, I didn't want to have any technology issues. So I would like to just have a conversation with you. I'm going to present some points, but then I'd love for us to have a dialogue and you to ask questions. As Valerie mentioned, put things in the chat. It's a good place for us to be able to have conversation, but also if you need resources and there are things I don't talk about today, I can also take note of those and then send up a follow-up. I always start my conversations with community norms. It's a good way for me to just level set the conversation we're going to have. I ask that you remain open-minded in the topics that we're going to talk about, the courageous space that we're going to hold for each other. This is a safe space. This is a place where you can be, and you're going to feel and know that you're safe. You're in your home. So my hope is that that's the safest place that you can be. But I want you to also consider, are you unsafe or are you uncomfortable? So very often in these difficult conversations, we think that we are unsafe, but we're actually just really uncomfortable with what's happening, and that's okay. So I encourage you to pull out a pen and a paper, and everything that triggers you, begin to write that down and explore what that looks like and what that means for you. That doesn't mean that you're going to get it discovered on this call. Whatever that trigger is probably deep-rooted and lots of things from your background, but it gives you a way to say, why do I feel this way about that word, that topic, that thing? So that's what my encouragement for you. I also encourage you to only speak from personal experiences. Using an I statement is a really good way to do that. Many of you represent neighborhood associations, and that's great, but it also is important that you're not representing the collective of what your group feels, that you actually have had these experiences and you ask those questions based on those experiences. I also ask that you expect and accept non-closure. That means that at the end of this, you may feel like, did I get everything I needed? Did I learn all that I'm supposed to learn? I think I need more resources. That's okay. All those feelings are important, and all those feelings are probably what you're going to feel. So I hope that you have that. Are there any other things you want to add to the conversation to make sure you feel your most safe and authentic self in this conversation? If not, then I'm fine with a thumbs up. You can do a reaction at the bottom and just let me know that you're good for us to move forward. Perfect. So there were kind of a couple of scenarios that were sent over to me that I want to kind of walk through. And one of them is going to be lengthier because it covers a lot of the things that will end up in the second part of the question. But it was around, how should a member respond in a meeting when they're confronted with some type of maybe hostile remark, uncomfortable remark, or even unsafe remark. And so there are a few things that I have to address as a precursor before we can get into a conversation about a meeting. Because more than likely, a meeting is not the first time in which someone has had an interaction, not necessarily with you, but with the topic or with the issue. So it's either, doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I understand that things happen. But in my experience, I have seen in meetings that people have an advanced or overwhelming level of frustration. And the only way to get attention is to do some of the things that might be considered in a hostile environment. So when we start this, I have to think about a few things. So I think about this from kind of a past, present, future text. So from the past standpoint, I want you to think about, how did you come about the neighborhood that you live in? How did you come to understand the history and the value and the integrity and the culture of your neighborhood? How did you, and in particular, when I talk about history, I'm saying your community history, but I'm also talking about kind of the global history of redlining or the fight for same-sex couples to live in houses together, the fight for interracial couples to live together. Like, what do you know about that relative to either your neighborhood or kind of this global perspective? What is the value of other cultures? And this goes beyond, a lot of times I hear, I want to live in a diverse and multicultural community. I want to raise my children in that. Beyond that, right, as a statement, what do you really know and how do you really express and live out the value of other cultures of people? And then I get to this part of the conversation. I got my notes here, sorry. I get to this part of the conversation where I then say, how do all of those things get exhibited and expressed out into the world? And so that usually is that you have some level of thought, idea, prejudice, bias that then has the potential to turn into some type of behavior, which we hope is not harmful, but it could also be harmful. So I start there when I'm thinking about, before we can even get to the meeting, how did you even come about understanding the neighborhood that you live in, so that you can then have the knowledge or the precedent for why a person might show up and have a level of frustration. There are many people who don't really know the history of the neighborhoods they live in. And so when they don't have the context or have the background about how communities have been restored and renewed and people have been removed and things have been gentrified, they don't have that. So when there's conflict or there's a lash out, then there's sometimes a direct relationship with the past and what's presently happening. And if you don't have that context, if you don't know what's happening, you don't have the identity piece there, then you're bumping up against something you have no idea about. And then that person, of course, is expressing themselves the way that they feel that they need to express themselves. So in real time, I'll give you maybe a scenario. So in Nashville, we have quite a few neighborhoods that were historically for Black individuals to live. And so let's go a little bit further. And there's still many of those communities. But let's go a little bit further about what it may feel like. So I want to give you a scenario about what this might feel like. So if let's just say I walk by your house and I see that you have this huge tree in your backyard, and I decide I want that tree. So I come and I bring my, backhoe or whatever, things are needed for, I have no clue, whatever construction items are needed. And I come pull that tree out of your backyard. And you're trying to figure out like, what is happening here? But what is happening is very similar to what happens when we have new folks, well-intentioned folks who move into neighborhoods and move into communities who say, I want access to your area. And I want it, and I'm not going to necessarily talk about it. I'm not going to necessarily ask you about it. I'm just going to come and take it. And what then I think happens, or what I believe happens, is that I don't have the institutional knowledge about that tree was built by, put in the ground by your grandparents, and your family pets were buried under that tree, and all of this history, that it's an important piece to you, but also that it's just important to you because it's in your backyard, right? It's a very similar scenario to what it feels like to have all of the challenges that we've had in our culture and our community. And then and I'm not just, I want to be clear, I'm not just centering Black individuals, but I'm giving you that because race to me is always the most difficult part. So it's the place where I have to start the conversation. But I give you that scenario because that happens all the time. And neighborhood leaders and neighborhood community members and leaders across the city always ask and say, well, how do I do better by people in my community? I say, well, you have to understand their frustration from a very kind of granular level. This is not even and it might not even be their frustration. That's the other part that could be a frustration for you. It may not even be their frustration. It may be their parents' frustration. My parents still can tell you about the interstate that comes through North Nashville. So we still have people very present and very living who remember those activities, and it triggers them in some way. So again, we have those super well-meaning folks who move into neighborhoods and want to be active, right? Like you want to go into community, you're like, I want to do the best for my community. I want it to be amazing. I want it to be well. And then, but I'm also going to potentially push out someone else because they may not be as present, they may not be as active, maybe they don't care, and that's the perception that I have. So then we build these kind of transactional relationships with each other. We never really build relationships. We just kind of go through like, maybe I wave, maybe I don't, but maybe I wave. Hope that's the hope. So that's kind of one point. It's like, what happened in the past? When we think about kind of this middle space or kind of the present space we're living in, we're living, I don't think, I hope that I don't have to tell anybody, we're living in super tense times relative to politics and economics, healthcare, socially, and then of course racially. We have this very tense climate that we're living in, and we're really testing the limits of what it means to be a good neighbor. If you've heard me speak before, which is not reflective of the wonderful work of Neighbor to Neighbor, but it is reflective of who we are as people, is that I think we have real difficulty being good neighbors. And part of that is because we often associate good, that word, or bad with our own standard for good or for bad. So the example is, if I live next door to someone who has an Airbnb and they have rented it to someone who has extremely loud music and it's blaring, immediately what I see happen is, well, that person is greedy. They only want the money. They don't care about me and my home. They don't care about my kids. They don't care about this neighborhood. I immediately see the most overwhelming, maybe even gross accusations of humanity, because what we've done is we don't operate with benefit of the doubt. We just operate at doubt. We just operate at the place where that's not the standard I want to live in or next to, so then it's bad. So we associate that with those good and bad behaviors based on our own behavior and not take any consideration into anybody else, their perspective, their background, their culture, or just knowing them, like just saying, hi, how are you? I noticed that you rent out to Airbnb. Can we have a conversation about it? Let me tell you about my kids. We don't do that. Instead, we jump towards the most negative. How I also know this, I have confirmation of this because I'm in a lot of neighborhood groups on social media, and I'll see someone post something very simple, something very basic. I've got lots of screenshots too, just FYI, because I use them as research when I'm trying to figure out how we go from a really simple message to a full-on onslaught of accusatory behavior or things that are so off topic. Again, because human nature makes it where we identify people, particularly in this time of communal trauma, we identify people based on our own understanding of good and bad, or they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing, or they are this person or that person. That is then exacerbated by whatever biases we have that we haven't even identified. So things in our background, how we've socialized towards other people, whether it be people of different race and ethnicity, whether it be people of different sexual orientation, whether it be people of different ages, whether it be because you're a renter and I'm a homeowner, whatever it is, we are socialized in some way to think that. I'll give you an example. An example is, this is a common thing you hear when you go into a neighborhood and you see toys in the front yard. The first thing I bet you think is that's a renter. They don't care about their property. And they don't care about it because they don't own it. Is that true? Do we just make that up? They don't care about their property? Or do they feel so safe and so comfortable that they can leave their toys outside for their kids so that their kids can come and play with it? I'm not saying to abandon right versus wrong. It's what saves you and protects you and helps you in unsafe environments. But I'm also saying, are you willing to question what you've learned and how you've socialized the things? This is all going to lead us back to what happens in a hostile meeting, but you have to identify or address these things first. So then moving forward, we have to think about this kind of hostile community meeting as future. And I say that because if we've done the first two, if we identify the first two and acknowledge that those things exist, then the future is that we have this meeting and that potentially there's this environment that doesn't feel comfortable. And so when that happens, I think often we are looking for a solution. When you come to these type of things, you're looking for like, I want the 1, 2, 3 solution. And I probably have, particularly in this time, in some ways, abandon that about 50% of saying, okay, here's a list of things. Now I do have a list of things because I know how people want things, but I also have a list of questions because I can't, my lawyer answer is, not a lawyer, but I always pretend like one, is my lawyer answer is, I think, Alicia, are you an attorney? Did I remember that correctly? Okay. So it depends, because I don't have every scenario in front of me that will let me know, like, okay, these are the 1, 2, 3s of what you should do. So instead, I have questions. And I will put these after I get done, because it's several of them. I'll put them in the chat. I'll just dump them in there so you can have them, you grab them. And these are questions that I've come up with. These don't have to be your questions. And you don't have to use all of them, because this is, of course, happening in real time. So you don't have time to go through 30 questions if someone is having an experience in a meeting with you and your board or your other members. So it's about figuring out what's the important question for you to kind of check yourself as these triggers are happening. So here's a few questions. So one is, do I need to respond or have a reaction? Sometimes I think we are so apt to respond back to things when, and social media is that culture, right? Social media is the place where we get in the comments and we go down the rabbit hole to no return, and then we can't figure out how we are 13 messages in to a debate that doesn't even belong to us. I mean, that's the part that kills me. It's like, doesn't belong to you. Do I need to respond? Do I need to have a reaction? So the the follow-up to that is, do I have enough background to respond? Like, do I even know what I'm talking about? Is that person coming with some of those things I just mentioned? Are they coming with pre-existing conditions, if you will, that I have no clue about? Do I have the tools that I'm supposed to have to manage this and be well? I don't know. Is my voice important in this conversation? You know, it's about uncentering your voice, particularly if you're in a community that is multiracial, particularly if you're in a community that is divided by age, particularly if you're in a community that's transitioning in some way with you know, some other type of difference, some other type of diversity. Do you have to be the voice to speak about it? Or does that person just need space? Maybe. What happens if I stay quiet during that time? I mean, maybe if I stay quiet, it will figure itself out. But if I'm so quick to run and jump and try to resolve it, I haven't given that person the time, I haven't respected, but I also haven't considered that maybe all they want is just a place to say the things they want to say, and then they're done, right? And so then I may not need to even respond. So that's one set of questions. Do I respond or do I have a reaction? Then I have follow-up questions there. Have I listened? You know, part of listening, I say listening is a spiritual act. It's something you do with your entire body. It is not something you just kind of, you know, do with your ears. It's like literally your whole body has to be positioned to listen to another person. And so what does that mean? So for me, when I'm sitting in sometimes contentious situations, I sit with people and I say, is it okay for me to take notes? And I'm not asking to take notes to respond. I'm asking because these might be things I need to solve at some other point. It might just be that I don't want to forget. It might be that the way that my brain works, I need visuals. You might have to doodle. I don't know what your process is. What I can tell you is, how are you listening? And do you have a way to listen? Have I made this person feel welcomed in the past? Because again, part of listening is about making sure that a person feels like I see them, I acknowledge you, I recognize that you're important to this process and your voice is important to the process. Okay. The next question is, if you've read the 4 agreements, it says don't take things personal. I never will tell you not to take things personally. What I will say is, the question is it really about me? And I'm going to get to that in just a second, but is it really about me? Is what they're saying my responsibility? Am I responsible for their upset? Have I contributed to their frustration? Is this person angry about something else and need to just have a place to vent? And we're the safe space they chose to come to. When I hear triggering words like racist, sexist, ageist, white supremacist, do I then internalize them to belong to me? That last one is a doozy, right? That's the one that's uncomfortable, because we're in a time where those words are huge, right? But imagine how huge they are for a person who it feels like they've experienced that, okay? That's why I say, is it really about me, or is it about the experience of that person? They need the space and I'm supposed to hold it for them. My next set of questions is around, is there an achievable outcome that I can get to at some point during this conversation? Like, do I have the tools I need at this point? Am I able to use my resources in some way to get them what they want? If not, then I'm not trying to negotiate with them in the middle of a community meeting. right? I've seen that happen. It does not fare well, because what it does is it continues. You don't even necessarily know the root of the issue. So you're trying to manage a problem that doesn't necessarily, that you don't even know how it existed, how it started. I've had situations where people have been highly contentious, and once we get to the root and then we acknowledge them and then we respect them, they're laughing at the end of the conversation because I didn't try to solve their problem. That's what I'm modeling here. Is I'm asking the questions, or I'm getting to a point where I'm just having the opportunity to just ask those good questions, get that good dialogue going. I don't need to achieve or solve any problem in real time. Do I have the tools to manage this situation? I think I already said that one. And then this is the last point. This is the last question. Is this really a hostile situation? Am I uncomfortable or am I unsafe? There is a difference between someone who is challenging the conventional ways in which you all do things as an organization versus someone who's creating a negative and harmful interaction for your organization. And that may feel like a very fine line, but it's probably a thicker line than you're willing to sometimes acknowledge. A person who stands up and uses their voice, and in particular, very honestly, and particularly as a Black woman, my voice, my inside, outside, grown up voice can be very overwhelming if your perception of me and your bias of me is that I'm supposed to sit and be muted. Right? So, and that happens with all types of people. We think certain things about Asian American people. What are they supposed to do? We think certain things about individuals who we know identify with LGBTQ plus. We have very particular ideologies about people based on what we know or what we think about them. But their way of pushing back may just be their way of pushing back, and it's not harming you. You got to really ask that question of yourself. Am I being harmed? Now, let me be clear here. Safety is a very personal decision, right? Like I can't tell you you're not safe or you are, but you got to make some decisions about what that looks like. So what we saw this summer was we saw I think I saw 2 or 3 instances, but I've seen several more, but 2 or 3 instances of women calling the police on Black individuals. I've seen male and female. And what happens in real time, because it's videoed, is that we start to see their voice elevate and elevate and elevate, and nothing is happening to them. But they are screaming to say, I'm unsafe. And they're getting themselves worked up to be unsafe, but they're not unsafe. Because I can see you on video. Nothing is happening. No one is close to you. No one is touching you. No one is throwing anything at you. I'm standing here, you're standing there. That behavior shows up in Nextdoor. I've seen that, and there are lots of articles about how this happens, but you all know this. It shows up in Nextdoor, shows up in our social media groups. It shows up in ways where we make ourselves feel unsafe, and so then we create greater divides in our community. So again, before we even can get to our neighborhood meetings, sometimes that's all that's happening in the world. That's why those questions are important. That the first and last question are probably the most important for me. So do I need to respond or have a reaction? And is this really a hostile situation? I'm not saying that you don't feel unsafe, but I'm saying you should question what that means or looks like in the context of the situation. And you should be willing to unlearn some of the biases that you have been socialized towards race and culture and people, right? You have to question that. Other behaviors that you might consider, in particular, prior to a meeting, that could happen, that could really be helpful. And hopefully, if you haven't had one of these meetings, then you can put some of these things in place. I think it's about acknowledging, we're in this time where this is a really solid ground for you to acknowledge the historic harm or the things that have happened in your community, whether it's been in your neighborhood association or just in the community, and being able and being willing to have that acknowledgement. It really goes a long way for people to feel like they can become included in the conversation. Next is about putting some community values in place. If you have community values, I'd love for you to, if you have them handy, drop some in, give people advice on those. But what are those community values? And this has to be more than saying you want a diverse community. This has to be that you're willing to also call out the community members who may not always feel welcome, really calling that out in a document or a community value as not just we want to be diverse, but we want to make sure that all ages, if we're talking about, this is a traditionally or historically older neighborhood with older families or older people, We don't have young children. We want to make sure all people, all families of all ages are able to enjoy the benefits of our community, right? Get explicit. We want to make sure that we honor the integrity of the historical identity of this community as historically Black. It is okay to do those things. When we don't call it out, we cannot be held accountable to it. And very often we are very comfortable with using jargoned language, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, anti-racist, with no definers of what that means. But then when you put those community values in place and you give those definers, I'm now more willing to engage. I'm now more willing to say, oh, you see me, you value me, I am important to the process. The next thing is when they're not, when these values are not lived out, be comfortable calling it out. I don't mean that, Jennifer didn't say something in a meeting, and so we're going to say, Jennifer, you're a terrible person. I don't mean that. I mean that when you use language that's less inclusive than you would want to based on those community values or based on what's been expressed to you, when there's been an oversight on something, whether it's a person's name or a person's identity in some way, or you weren't mindful or something, or you posted something that you didn't, it got perceived differently than you expected for it to, it's okay to say, you know what, we want to just acknowledge that wasn't our intention. And we're acknowledging it and we're taking accountability for it and want to be transparent towards it. Now, again, I have more trust towards you. That singular thought alone is the reason why people have challenges with trusting government, because there's a lack of transparency and accountability. Okay, there's a lack of trust there. And so it's the same thing in your community, your neighborhood associations. Folks have a really difficult time with being in community with people who cannot say, I was wrong, or we didn't handle this correctly, or we could have done it better. Whatever language feels best for you. Set expectations that engagement may look different from here on out. So I've talked about this a lot of times, particularly with neighbor to neighbor in panels or what have you, is that we look at engagement as meetings and showing up to community events or night out for crime or different things like that. And that may not necessarily fit someone's time, someone's identity, someone's culture, their background, all types of things. I see community meetings on Wednesday nights and I think, well, maybe you don't want people in your community to come if they go to church or they go to some faith institution, right? Or you want to have something on a Saturday, the same time as children's baseball, basketball, soccer games. Just giving you examples of, how do we set expectations that engagement may need to look very different than what it's looked like in the past. Spend time building trust. Trust is a metric that I believe is often unmeasured, and really that's a disservice to your community. It doesn't mean that you're going to every meeting write down, the numbers of people who come, but it's those pieces of feedback that people give that say, when I first moved over here, I didn't feel welcome, or my kids didn't feel like they could walk down the street, or whatever the feedback is. And then when they come back and say, but now you all have really done a great job of making sure that we feel welcome and included in the community. I really just wanted to tell somebody that is trust. That is built in trust. And that is something that you can absolutely ask them, can we share this out? But more importantly, can we share it within our community, our neighborhood association meeting? Can we share this in our newsletter? Would you mind being spotlighted in some way? And even say, when I first got here, I didn't feel comfortable. See, that's honoring somebody's truth and their experience and their reality as something that's important, not sugarcoating and making it feel good later. And just honor people in that way. And that helps to build that trust. Create spaces and places specifically for uncomfortable conversations. That may mean that once a quarter you all, or once a year, or what have you, that you consider having a series of uncomfortable conversations with each other about things in your community, right? I'm not saying go outside and try to change the world. What's happening in your community? Is new development coming? And it's coming because you follow the council meetings or you're the neighborhood leader. Like, what's happening and how can you all have those conversations? There's lots of techniques online about how to manage those conversations. And of course, I'm happy to support that in any way. And I know Neighbor to Neighbor is, but the point is build in space to have that uncomfortable conversation. I see what time it is, and I also see, and this always happens. So here's what I will do, because I think that this is a better way to maybe manage this. I'm going to run through a few more of these about what to do in a meeting, just a couple of them. I'm going to touch on them, and then I'll send my notes to Valerie and Jim to send to you all to really have the step-by-step of what I'm going to talk about. But here's a few things that happen during a meeting, if and only if it makes sense. One, have a zero tolerance policy about personal attacks. So here's what I mean. There is a very specific difference about someone calling out a systemic harm, like that there has been racism perpetuated in our neighborhood association meetings, versus calling you, the leader, individually a racist. Two different things. And so if somebody calls out like this, or we are not as inclusive of that couple down the street, we're not being as inclusive to them because they are same-sex marriage, right? That is something very different than saying you yourself are discriminating against that couple. It is important to call out those harms, but I think zero tolerance policy for personal attacks. If it makes sense, depersonalize to the degree that you can. So focus on the facts and not the personal, back and forth, as I mentioned already. Be careful of condescending language. Don't take this personal. You should just calm down. You took it the wrong way. Those are what I call aggressive aggressions. They're not even micro. Those are huge when someone is expressing themselves to you in the way they know how to express, and they are being shunned in some way, or not seen or heard or valued in some way. And then the last thing I'll put in here is ask them if they're willing to discuss this more offline, so you can come up with some solutions and bring it back to the group. I know that we're in a time where it feels like every conversation has the potential to be hostile. I know that. And to some degree they may be, but I want you to remember that it's not necessarily a hostile situation. It is that it might feel uncomfortable, but that's why I keep my pen and my paper with me and I take notes. Because when someone says a word to me that doesn't feel comfortable, I write it down and sit with that. Why does that trigger me? Lastly, if I can't keep my mouth closed, I put my hand over my mouth. I do it all the time. Physically put my hand over my mouth. Because it reminds me, it's just my own reminder that this is not your opportunity to speak. You don't need to say anything. You don't need the floor. I found this quote from Ronald Reagan that said, peace is not about the absence of conflict. It is about the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. I believe that you can get to peace, but you're going to have to get some conflict before you can get there. So I'm going to turn it back over to Valerie. I'm so sorry for going over. I knew I would. It's a good conversation to have, but I hope that was helpful, at least in some part, for you all as you think about these conversations within your community.
Yeah, Kia, thank you so much. And I've gotten comments about we really need Kia at a longer session, so we'll try to work through that in the future. Questions, anybody?
And just unmute yourself if you do, so that I can kind of see where to look.
So I have a question. So like I said, I recently relocated back to Nashville. I don't know if it's temporary or long-term, because who knows what anything is. Time is a construct right now. Mm-hmm. But I did operate my home as an Airbnb while I was in LA. And now I've come back and I found it a little bit difficult to re-engage with my homeowners association, because I did feel like I was treated one way when I was an Airbnb operator. And now that I'm back as a homeowner, it's different. And so I guess my question is, I don't know what the future holds, and I may go back to being an Airbnb person and flying between LA, but I want to give my fellow homeowners the sense that, I kept this home because it's a refuge for me and it's important to me and my family. Whether I'm in it all the time or I allow other guests to be in it, it's important to me. And so I want to have a place in the community. How do I make that concern known without it feeling like I'm saying to them, you ostracized me or you made me feel different and apart? Because I've found it difficult to kind of re-engage, and they're wanting to re-engage me because I'm back.
Oh, okay, good. So the good news is they want to re-engage you. And I think if you have an ally in that group, or in that, whoever that neighborhood association is, then it's opportunity for them to be advocates for you. You absolutely should feel ostracized. Like, that's a real thing. And I will I can't push back on your feelings, but what I will say is I want you to feel and honor that space for yourself. We often feel like we have to make things accommodatable for other people, and that is your home. If you want to, if you have an ally in that group, I think it's important to share potentially some historical context for why it's important for you to own your own home, why it was important for you to be able to keep that as a wealth building tool, an economic tool for your legacy, whether that be you leave it to, you have it for yourself for now as you traverse the world, or that you have it for your kids and your grandkids. Historically, what we know, and if you don't know this, there are again lots of resources. Historically, because of redlining, and then also just because of other practices and legislative policies, Black individuals, Brown individuals have not always been able to own their own homes. And our economic wealth gap is so, I think Black individuals are 242 years behind the average white family. That is a lot of years in terms of the wealth gap that is between us. And so if you can share some of that history to say what you just said, this is a refuge for me, this is important to me, but this is also important to the legacy of what my grandparents did for me so that I could get here. And now I'm going to do that for the next generation. What I would hope happens, and I think we struggle with this, which is what I meant when I said we have challenges with being good neighbors. We really struggle, and this is a longer conversation, we struggle with empathy. We struggle with seeing someone else, understanding someone else, again, because we're very selfish people. And particularly when you're in trauma, which we all are in trauma, some of us exacerbated more. When you're in trauma, then you can only look out for self because you're self-preservation mode. So I hope that answers the question, but I would say you're entitled to feel the way you feel. I would also have ask them to have an ally or someone that you can really talk to and express how you felt ostracized, and maybe educate them on why this is important, and Airbnb and why that's a venture for you to have diversify your income. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. I also want to say that we have possibly someone on the phone. So if you're on the phone and want to ask Kia a question, you have to *6 to unmute. Next question.
I saw Tawana had unmuted before, so I want to acknowledge her.
Thank you. I guess I have more of a comment than a question. Every point that you have made tonight is stuff that we are dealing with here currently in Cane Ridge. And just last night, I had a over 90-minute conversation with a neighbor about starting some difficult conversations. And it has taken me almost, we're heading into a year just to get her to the point of being willing just to have conversations. It is extraordinarily uncomfortable, and I look forward to getting the notes from you to help everyone move through these conversations, because I personally have found that once people are able to be honest and understand it's okay to be honest, that the conversations quickly get much easier. You kind of got to get over that hump and step into that zone. And then it's like, okay, I can do this. I can have this conversation. So I think this is really timely. I really mean what I say about it would be awesome to have some kind of gathering like this other times in the future to bounce things off one another. So thank you for everyone who is here. And Jim, I would just like to know, where are the rest of the men?
There are some thoughts about that as well, but Tawana, I want to acknowledge and appreciate that you all are going through those conversations. One way to get started, I don't have this in my notes, but I will add it. One way to get started is to have everyone share their story. Why was this neighborhood important? You ask some question. Storytelling is very powerful, because what happens is it's called neural coupling. The idea is that if my brain and your brain were on a brain scan machine while you were telling me a story, I'm having the same reaction that you're having. And stories bring us together and they connect us. What we would find is that it's very profitable for us to be apart. So the reason why we're in the Great Divide now is because it's very profitable. I mean, start to look at where the money lives relative to why we are so divided. But once you start to break down that wall, and storytelling can do that, then you'll start to see that you all have many more commonalities probably than not. because you'll find something in their story that you can relate to, and vice versa. And that starts to break down some of those walls and barriers to having a conversation. So I will put that in the notes for you as well.
And I'd suggest too, if you have a chance to go onto our YouTube channel, we did a really good conversation last week and with Jackie and Steph and Wasey on the topic of storytelling in neighborhoods and how to do some of that. So you might want to read that one or listen to that story. I think it's up. If it's not up yet, it will be up in the next week.
Yeah, I'll get that tagged in too, because that's just a good resource to have.
I'll just say this has me thinking that when I was doing neighborhood leadership last year, we did do some kind of bringing people together events like you heard about storytelling, but I can honestly say that there were many times I thought about the disconnect of like me as a facilitator or someone that works with youth and like me as a neighborhood person of like going through the agenda and bringing people in. And there was definitely a lens on that of like, who are we going to hear from and why? But like, if I'm honest, like, you know, the work that it takes to even get people to overcome like coming to the table, like we would put that on like events and we didn't really do that in meetings. And so then it was often the same people, it was less people, and it was very much not the makeup of our neighborhood. And so I think back on that and I think about like, to do what you're talking about does take a lot of extra work. And like, I can see where we did it in pockets. And I look back and I'm like, I wish we had done more where we had like really pushed some of these things, which are bigger. Like tonight, of course, we can't contain all this in like 45 minutes at all. And again, just thank you for being willing to be the one here facilitating with us and sharing it more widely. But yeah, it's pushing me to think like, if I take a more meaningful role again in neighborhood leadership, like, you know, you got to bring people in and say like, okay, well, this is going to take work, but are we willing to do it? And that's an even bigger question. So.
Yeah, I think to that point, Jackie, also, sometimes you just need to be a participant, even though you're the leader in the conversation or in the organization, you need to also just be able to be a participant. Bringing in a facilitator is really helpful. There was also a question about kind of one-on-one conversations if you feel like there's going to be a conflict. Although I'm not renewed, I am a Rule 31 mediator. Alicia has the same capabilities as an attorney. Find an attorney, find someone. Oh, you don't? Okay, well, no. Okay.
I can do it. I should not.
Yes, I was gonna say, yes, you have the capability. That's all I'm gonna say. But finding someone who can facilitate that conversation or that conflict could be really helpful so that everyone gets a chance to still participate, because neighborhood leadership is, I mean, you still have a voice because you're still a leader. I mean, still a neighbor rather in the conversation. So it brings up that point. We will have this conversation in the spring, I believe, during the conference. Yeah. And so one of the suggestions I'm hearing from a variety of you is maybe we can do something, I can think of something innovative for us to be able to put up ideas of how you've managed some of these situations in the past, so that there's a dialogue between everybody really sharing lived experience from leader to leader. And then we can also talk about strategies to move forward.
And we're really excited about having you in the spring at our C4N conference for neighborhoods. And I hope I see all of you there. Anybody else?
Well, this is Cheryl. I just want to say that this has been very interesting. I have lived in my home for over 30 years. And since I've retired, I have become a little bit more aware of the neighborhood and the diversity and the changes I've experienced during that time. And so to be aware that this activity is occurring is very exciting. And I will definitely look forward to seeing more of the details about how our particular neighborhood does interact. I kind of signed up for the app, you know, where we have the communication, and that's been very interesting. But I really have never participated in anything like this. And so I definitely looking forward to learning more and to be more involved.
Thank you for being here, Cheryl. Appreciate that.
Okay.
Any other thoughts? I'm used to silence a little bit during these conversations because everybody's trying to get their thoughts together, and of course life is happening too. So
did we have a couple of folks join after we got started that want to introduce themselves? Okay.
Excuse me, this is Laura. While they're introducing themselves, I'm just curious regarding the scenario of the person whose voice continues to escalate, and they're not in harm's way, but they are sounding like they are in harm's way. They believe that they're in harm's way. How do you respond to that to attempt to de-escalate?
Yeah, I think some of it is there's a body language, and I have some of this in my notes. There's some body language things. I often say I sit down. So if someone stands up and starts talking and they're not being harmful. So again, this is about there's physical safety or unsafety happening, but I will sit down and get my notes, and that sometimes disarms them, because I'm not, if we're similarly spaced, meaning, and particularly if there's some reflection of each other. So, woman to woman, short to short, because I'm 5'1", like, then we look like we're kind of having a square off moment, which also can be tense for everybody else around in the space. So I kind of sit and just take a listener role versus a kind of leader role or what have you. The other thing is, and I have this in here because I wanted to, what was one other thing? Asking them if it feels comfortable, asking them an open-ended question. As an example, how would you like us to support you? How would you like us to support that thought? That what that has the potential to do is, if they are open, then they can start to break down, and you can see this in body language. So in this, don't over assume about it, but you can start to see maybe the shoulders are coming down, maybe they are not as tense in the jaw. Like, you can start to see some of those micro expressions happen. But when you see that, and you say, and then you can say, I'm very open for just asking that question. If you want to think about it, I'm okay with that as well. I'll be here afterwards. And if they start to see, because what we're building now is what I call a reservoir of trust. We're trying to create this relationship at a disadvantage, but I'm trying to create a space where that I'm caring for you, I'm willing to hear you, I want to hear what you're saying, that type of thing. So I would say asking that open-ended question can really be helpful to the process. And then, of course, I think, as I mentioned, having an opportunity to say, we can talk about this also offline and go through some strategies for what you think. In particular, there are lots of contentious situations, but building new houses, building new buildings, new rezoning, those are really sometimes can be highly contentious situations. If a person legitimately has some strategies for how they can be better, I mean, all the more reason to listen to what they're saying. It may not happen, but what I can tell you from a community engagement side, which I do quite a bit of that work, I always tell people, I can't guarantee the outcome. So I can't tell you what a developer is going to do or what the city's going to approve. What I can guarantee is the process is going to have integrity. So I'm going to listen to you all the way through. And so it's about creating that feedback loop with the community member to show them, I'm willing to listen to you. And even if we don't get what we want, we did it together. That's a very different approach than we're against each other.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you all so very much for being with us this evening. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you, Kia. And of course, you can reach out to Jim or I if you have any further questions or comments or thoughts, and we'll pass that on and get whatever resource that you need. Thanks again. And Jim, any other thoughts anything you want to say before we close out?
Okay, now I can talk. Just be watching your email. Sometime next week, we're going to be sending out a survey. We are getting ready for C4N Nashville, which will be on Saturday, May 15th this year. And we've identified quite a number of possible workshops. And we would like for you to complete a survey basically saying, if I was going to attend this event, these are, I think we finally said, these are the 4 or 5 that favorite workshops that I'd consider attending, so that we get some idea as we plan towards the coming year. And particularly because, you know, we're trying to model this year's C4 in Nashville on our 8 neighborhood passions. So getting input from this group will be really important to get more of that. And one of them is actually the Courageous Conversations topic. So follow up, if you would, with that email.
All right. Thank you all so much. Have a great night and a wonderful weekend. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.